Greetings to all, this is Johnson North Wales with the May-June 2019 build, the Kamov Ka-31 Helix in 1/72nd scale by Amodel. And there you have the helicopter on patrol. The Kamov Ka-31, NATO reporting name Helix, is a military helicopter developed for the Soviet Navy and currently in service with Russia, China and India in the naval early warning and control role. As with all Kamov helicopters except the Ka-60-62 family, the Ka-31 has a co-axially mounted contra-rotating main rotors. The airframe of the Ka-31 is based upon the Kamov Ka-27. One visually distinctive feature of the Ka-31 is the large antenna of the earlier warning radar, which is either rotating or folded and is stowed under the fuselage. The second is the reduction of the bulky electro-optical sensory suite beneath the cockpit. The landing gear retracts in order to prevent interference with the radar. The radar of the Kamov Ka-31 airborne early warning radar helicopter has a 360-degree coverage and can spot an aircraft-sized target 150 kilometers range, and surface ships are spotted at 100 to 200 kilometer range. The radar can track 30 to 40 targets simultaneously, and the helicopter has a data link to transfer target tracking data to the command post, land or mothership, and the Ka-31 is fitted with GPS and digital terrain mapping systems. All in all, a fairly capable system. And you can see it there in operation. It always reminds me of a bumblebee in a DIY store. It's only a two-man crew, with the systems operator being quite a busy chap. I think I bought this kit from Hannon's a while back, and it had been in the stash for a while, so it felt it was time to build it. The sprue quality is pretty hit or miss. There are faint panel lines and quite a bit of flash. Detail is a bit basic in places. Where there is detail, it's often made up of very small components brought together, and main weakness I think is quite the soft plastic, so things can be a bit faint. The decal sheet is good, but it's crowded. They seem to try and pack into a lot into quite a small space. So yes, a little bit of a pros and cons with that, but the decals were in good register. It began really with the upper fuselage there. Now the rear section of that had to be trimmed, or had to be cut off, and with a new part then replaced. I really want to draw out in this video the amount of trimming, fitting and sanding you have to do with this, and there's the issues of fitting the exhausts. As you can see, they're sanding everything to fit, and then on with some re-scribing. Now, the main re-scribing medium I tend to use is Dymo tape. I've already marked the panel lines in pencil, then my key set of scribing tools, the Tamiya scriber and a couple of others, along with a template, ruler, Dymo tape, and a pin in a pin vise as well. So we stick the Dymo tape to the first area, holds quite well. Then taking the pin in the pin vise, just draw gently across the surface. Key thing with re-scribing is never to apply too much pressure. Just gentle strokes, repeat strokes, until you're happy with it. Now the pin in the pin vise is often a good way of starting before going over to another tool. I find that particular tool is good for working around curved surfaces like aircraft fuselages, that kind of thing. So it's always just a fairly gentle, progressive process. It's something you don't rush, and then once it's done, just reinstate the lines visually in pencil to help you see what's going on. It also gives an indication of if something needs to be redone. After the initial scribing comes the initial filling as well. In this case, using the Perfect Products Deluxe Products Perfect Putty applied there, and then once it's set, wet a Q-tip, cotton wool bud, whatever you call it, and just wipe off the excess. Now this does reduce the amount of rework, because we all know the sanding can often obliterate detail, so I think that's one of the main strengths of that product. Now on with the fuselage itself. Now the interior took a bit of work, but they left the hatch for the ASW gear, and that needed to be blanked out, so that's a small blanking piece being fitted. Once that's done, it was on with some painting, just using Tamiya blue, and then picking out details on the instrument panel there. Often using dry brushing as well in that area. Making up the seat belts, starting off with Tamiya tape on a then cutting the tape into strips and attaching it. That tends to be my preferred, painting the appropriate colour first, and then just I find that's a fairly reasonable way of getting usable seat belts, or certainly my preferred method for doing so. And you can see there, yeah, quite an adequate result. And you can add to that the paint in the belt buckles as well. The fuselage needed some alignment tabs. As you can see, they helped, but not all that much. They needed a lot of trimming and fitting in their own right. And coming together, one of the main issues we had with this kit was the large step on the underside. Fitting the cabin ceiling. To get that to fit, I had to do a lot of trimming on the upper fuselage sides. On the interior, that mating face was a major issue that needed a lot of sanding and resanding work. And then fitting the cabin, doing test fits for the cabin ceiling and the upper fuselage as well. Tamiya extra thin used throughout, and some of the regular, just a standard Tamiya thicker glue as well. As with an A model kit, test fitting is absolutely everything in one of these builds. Test fit, trim, re-test fit, even as A models kits go, this is certainly not a shake and bake, and that cabin roof needed a lot of trimming, fitting, sanding and filling, particularly to blend it in effectively to the fuselage. So you can see here I'm trying a slightly different approach with this video. First attempt at really doing a vid that has more video footage within it, so to speak. So just working out my style and approach for this. After that was done, again I had to put a lot of filler. And as with all the forward sections on the fuselage, they needed trimming, fitting, test fitting to get this lot to go together. The sponsons as well left large gaps. That basically every joint on this needed filling and sanding and test fitting and reworking. And there you have the basic fuselage together. Now on with some shimming. First, to put a shim strip to deal with the step on the lower side, using the regular white top Tamiya cement as well. Then cutting thin strips. First checking that the gauge of the plastic I'm intending to use is going to fit okay. It's better to use too thin a gauge and then build it up in multiple strips. So I sort of decided to leave this area in full. I think one of the advantages of shimming over regular filling methods is that as long as there's glue on both sides of the shim, it contributes to the strength of the joint, whereas a lot of fillers are literally just that, just fillers, and they don't actually add much to the strength of a jointed area. So I think for areas like wing roots in particular, running shim strips is in many ways, in my mind, superior to just using filler, if only for the structural elements. And you can see, build out up in strips, make sure you run the to me extra thin both sides, and with a thinner plastic it then becomes more almost like running a weld rod, with the to me extra thin melting it into place. Build it up often in a number of strips, so it doesn't matter if one strip isn't quite wide enough. And then once they're in, it's fairly easy to take a knife to trim them. What I would suggest is it's worthwhile getting a fresh blade for this. So if you've got like your regular knife, get your high quality blade, or put a fresh blade in. Or we have like a general purpose modeler's knife, and then the more precision and high end one, and just trim off the excess shim. And if need be, repeat the process, adding more adhesive, trimming, and taking it back. And then if you trim, take back. And sometimes it might be necessary to run a file along joint, but what I'm saying it does give you is a good strong joint. That certainly requires a lot less sanding and rework and the subsequent re-scribing than you would with other filling methods. So I do have a bit of a soft spot for the use of shim strips. I'm not saying they're for every application, but particularly for aircraft modelling, where you've got longer joints like that, they're an effective method. That gives you quite a nice, neat join. That's the shimming. After that, I applied both Revell filler and Mr. Surfacer, sanding and building up on both on the underside. And then that came in for quite a lot of heavy sanding now, with various grades of sandpaper to take it back, because I still wasn't happy. Even with the shim strip, it needed a lot more work to finally level it out. Kept on checking the surface with a T-square, so squares can be seen then, just to make sure I had a nice flat underside. After that, I had to cut a hole for the rotation gear for the radar. Now on with imparting a bow into the rotor blades, so they've been cleaned up, taken off the sprues, and then it's a case of boiling water in a tub and just apply a gentle steady pressure. Now even with the relatively short rotor blades on Kamovs, because they're contra-rotating and being made of composite as well, they still have a noticeable bow. Not as dramatic as other helicopters, but it still needs to be imparted. And look at the point at which the main bend occurs, normally around midway, as you can imagine. Check it against the photographs, and if you've overdone it, you can always bend it back a little bit, and if need be, also top up the water, so you want it boiling or close to boiling. The rotor head itself was certainly quite a fiddly affair, and I think this is where the parts being particularly indistinct created a lot of problems. These tiny components needed a lot of individual cleanup, And I think certainly in terms of testing the patience, that was a particularly challenging area. On with the painting now. I'd already I fitted a canopy, the glazing, and applied the interior paint to the outer surfaces. Then, as I always do, I test on a can, make sure I've got good flow, and sometimes on my skin as well, and then just build up a darker base coat. And what I decided to do here was like a graduated grey pattern on a dark grey base. Well, not pattern, it was a single colour, but I built it up in a number of layers of progressively lightening tones of grey. So that was the first pass on my base. Again, testing on a can. Main reason I'm doing is don't test on card, because the card absorbs the paint, and if your thickness is wrong, it's not going to show up on card. So I find drinks cans are absolutely ideal for this, and in particular that I will often work with both Vallejo and Tamiya. In this case I painted this entirely with Tamiya paints. A drink can, just make sure you're not going to get any reactions or unfortunate effects due to chemical differences. And you can see at the back there I detailed up the that blanked off rear hatch a bit more to be representative of what was on the actual helicopter. And there you have it, with the masking applied for the aft of the exhaust area to mask that off. Now, with that painted and the weathering done with mostly with water-based pencils, artist pencils, I didn't go too heavily. I certainly didn't use Flory weathering wash on this, so this was all pencil-based weathering. Some dry brushing as well. And now we're on to, as you can see there, fitting up the undercarriage. As with A model's tendency to divide the sub-assemblies into very small parts, much more so than other companies, I find, it does make things like fitting the undercarriage a particularly fiddly affair. And I think this was no exception. Other companies seem to have done far more robust renditions of this. So if you look at things like the Airfix Hormone, and I believe even the Zvezda Helix, the undercarriage is far simpler to put on than the A model one. But I think, if you want to build a type, that's what you've got to go through. Just getting these parts to line up and everything not be twisted and the right orientation takes a bit of work. When that's done, and we're starting to have something that looks like the finished helicopter, before I apply any decals, I tend to use Johnson's clear. I know there's been a lot of criticism of using this. Again, test it on the can. But as a good base coat for to give myself a nice smooth finish, and before I put any other matte varnishes on, and certainly any weathering powders. The rotor heads, every joint needed to be clamped up. You had a tiny mating surface there, so that needed to be glued and clamped. Again, another very fiddly activity. I think that was one of the trickiest contra-rotating helicopters I've built. The decals went on okay. So with microset and microsole, yeah, as per usual, I started with the largest decals and just worked down till, quite frankly, just can't be asked anymore. So finished. Well, that was after a coat of matte coat as well. And there you have it. The Kamov Ka31 Helix. So, overall feelings about this kit. I'm going to be quite honest with you. Only build this if you really, really want one of these in your collection. The trouble is, if you want this AEW helicopter, I think that's the only kit out. There's no conversion sets. So, yeah, if you want the Kamov Ka31 Helix AEW, that's the kit you have to build. I'm reasonably happy with the end result. It looks like what it's supposed to be. But you had to work to get it in this case, and I felt but that is what it is with A model kits. So thank you for watching. Happy modelling. God bless. This is Chancellor North Wales, signing out.